Yep, just tell me when. Good. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. We have a small audience here, but we are also streaming this live so that we do have some people that are on, and then they will have the opportunity to watch this at a later time as well because it's being recorded and posted. This is our annual public forum for the school budget. I have passed out some material which I will go over, and I will also talk a little bit about the charter amendments as well, since that's part of the ballot that you'll be voting on in April. So we're going to start with a review of the school budget. This that I will put on the screen is what you have in front of you. I realize the numbers are small, but I will make sure that I make this as big as necessary. Is that big enough, or do you want me to make it bigger? Bigger? You got it. Oh yeah, let me do that. Hold on one second. Bigger? Do you want this one bigger? I'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So without going through all of the numbers, I want to provide some highlights first, and I want to show a couple of demonstrations about how different things impact our budget. But for reference sake, you can take a look at the approved budget for the 21-22 school year, which was $33,701,225. That was our FY22, the year that we're currently operating in. The initial draft of the budget for 23 came in at just under $35,100,000. We spent quite a bit of time going through that budget and making sure that we removed duplications, removed requests that were not needs, and we got it down to $34,232,050. So that is just over a $500,000 increase, which is a 1.58% change over the previous year. That's the whole operating budget. Before I get into some of the details in the actual chart, let me show you a couple of references. First, I want to focus on three major impact areas. So again, we said the budget increase was just over a $500,000. $190,652 of an increase is directly related to the transportation contract. And the transportation contract is something that we are required to have so that we can bus our students to and from school. We signed a multi-year contract. We know that prices have gone up, particularly with gas and propane. And so a $200,000, just shy of a $200,000 increase on the transportation cost for the year is a small percentage. But when you think about the entire increase that we're asking for of just over 500,000, 538.25, 190,652 of that is the transportation contract. Then in terms of oil and propane that we use to heat our school and our greenhouse, the total increase for next year, $120,280. I don't think that is a massive surprise to everyone, given what you're experiencing at the gas pumps these days. But so together, transportation, oil, and propane represents just over $310,000 of an increase. The last thing that I want to highlight is I have this listed as staff returned from leave of absence and also students returning from being homeschooled. So we have quite a few kids, quite a few families who chose to homeschool their children during the pandemic. Many of those families have indicated that they are prepared to bring their children back to school. We have several teachers that took leaves of absence so they could be with their children during the pandemic. So they're on unpaid leaves of absence. And in some cases, we were able to not replace them. So as an example, the number of kids that we have in kindergarten, in-person kindergarten this year, only requires us to have 5 classrooms. But I had a kindergarten teacher who put in for a leave of absence. I did not replace her because I only needed 5 classrooms given the lower number of kids that were attending in person. We are anticipating that we will have 6 classrooms in the 22-23 school year. So she comes back, we need her because we also have kids coming back. So that's what I mean by staff and kids returning has an impact on our budget. These are expenses that have always been built in, but because of the fact that a number of our families chose to keep their kids out of school during the pandemic, it did have an impact on some of our needs. So those needs will return, and that represents about a $201,000 increase. And it's really not an increase, it's what's being put back into the budget. It was budgeted previously. So those 3 items are roughly equivalent to the increase. That means every other expense is basically nothing. And that's not exactly true because we know that we have some increases. You know, the contracts for the certified and non-certified staff do call for a very small increase, a 1% increase. But we also have a number of retirements that are going into place at the end of this school year. And we've budgeted for some savings for their replacement. So the savings and the increased costs in the other areas really offset each other. And we can almost attribute the entire $530,000 requested increase to these 3 items. Okay, questions on that? All right. The other reference that I just want to show you is I want to take a look at just the last 4 years of the operating budget for the school department. And these 4 years really, it's like the year just prior to COVID hitting us, and then our entire experience through the pandemic. So in 2019, the total school operating budget was $33,387,864. In 2020-21, we had a 1.42% increase. In 2021-22, we actually had a decrease of $160,733, which is roughly 0.5% lower than it was the previous year. And then for 22-23, the requested increase is $538.25, which is a 1.58% increase. So the 3-year change is $844,186 if you add these 3 together, which is a 2.53% increase spread over 3 years. And that on average is under a 1% increase per year, just looking at the last 3 years. These are the pandemic years that I'm talking about. So again, just a reference. I understand we still spend a lot of money on the schools. The schools do represent the largest part of the budget for the 2 towns. That is true everywhere. But I wanted to show that the requests that we're making are not really as significant as what I'm seeing in a lot of our surrounding towns. A lot of our surrounding towns are looking at 3% and 4% increases on a very regular basis, and we're trying to keep it as low as we possibly can. Okay, so that's that. Questions on that piece? All right, let's take a look at the specific lines of the budget for 22-23, which is in this column that is highlighted in green. Column N, and this is what you have in front of you as well. A couple of things to point out is that this is the FY22 budget, the year that we're currently in, and this is the school committee approved for next school year. We are anticipating a very small increase in state aid. from last year, from 226 to 242. Very small, that's all we're getting for an increase. There are some changes in some of our other revenues that we get from the state. Group home aid for the group home that we are responsible for, that is housed in Exeter. We have lost about $10,000 in group home aid over the prior year, but we've gained about $10,000 in some reimbursement for higher cost special education needs. Our English language learners, we have so few of them, we don't even get $1,000, so that is basically even. And then our regional transportation actually increased by about $100,000, which is great. But our non-public transportation, which we were assuming in last year's budget that we were getting about $137,000 in non-public transportation, that's reimbursement for our responsibility for transporting kids to private schools and charter schools within our region. That money was taken away. And this was after the budget was passed last year. So we anticipated 136,873, but we actually got zero. And this year we built in zero. So while we had an increase of 100,000 roughly in regional transportation, we had a decrease in more than that for our non-public transportation. So that's kind of the give and take there. The school committee has also voted to move some funds from unassigned fund balance. So when we have a budget in place, we do our best to save money throughout the year. And at the end of the year, if we end with a balance, that money becomes unassigned. And the school committee can decide to then apply it to the following year to offset the impact to the taxpayers. They've done that on a very regular basis. This year, they voted to move $230,000 in. Okay, so that's a revenue that counts, that offsets the impact on the taxes. And then last year, they started to move some money that we were experiencing in terms of savings from the healthcare reserve that we have. They started to move some money into the operating budget as a revenue so that we can offset the post-employment healthcare costs of some of our retirees. So that has continued this year as well. We are also experiencing an increase in some of our revenues. The tuition for preschool has, we've gotten a better return on our tuitions, and we have a couple of other sources where we bring money in. So we recorded about a $46,000 increase in anticipated additional income. So that again will offset the budget expenses as well. And then I want to highlight this CTE tuition line. About 5 years ago was the first time that we actually had an approved career and technical education program that is now offered in Exeter West Greenwich schools. We now have 3, and we have also applied for an additional 5 more. And they've gotten through the first round of review at the state level, and we expect in May to hear final word on whether any of those 5 new applications that we have will be approved. When we have an approved career and technical education program, it means that we can open up seats in those classrooms for kids who can pay tuition to come to us. And remember that we also pay tuition for some of our students to go elsewhere. So for example, we don't offer a welding program, but if a kid really wants to be a welder, there are welding programs in the state. They can apply and get accepted to that program. We pay that tuition. And so for a long time, we paid tuition out and never got anything in because we had no approved CTE programs. Again, we now have 3. And you can see that when this budget was approved in February of 2021, we were anticipating $230,000 worth of revenue in from kids that were paying tuition to come here. That actually went up to $317,000, a little over $317,000, because we had new kids that enrolled after the budget was approved. And now, based on, we have some kids that are graduating, so we have 12th graders that are paying tuition that are leaving, but we have already approved 5 new children to come to us for the 3 programs that we currently have approved. And so our tuition is now at just under $350,000, and that's with 3 programs. So it's really important for me to talk about this, because if we have more programs that are in the pipeline, that's opportunity for us to continue to bring more revenue in that will offset the expense of running our schools on an annual basis. Okay. All right. Yes. The 3 programs that are currently approved are the Ag Science program. That was the first one that we had approved. We also have a visual arts program, and then we have a computer science program. The computer science program has a couple of different paths in it, including the opportunity for kids to earn their pilot license for drones. So it's pretty cool. Some pretty cool things that we offer in that program. Those are the 3, as I said, that we can have tuition kids come in for. The 5 that we've applied for, I hope I remember them all, but it's biomed science, biotechnical science. There is a wind energy CTE program, which is really exciting. There are no other approved CTE wind energy programs in the state at the current time, so we would be among the first. And that will, of course, draw the attention of the students that we currently have in our own school, but certainly we would expect some kids from outside to apply for that as well. We are also in the process of approval for a culinary arts program. We also have a, say that again? Early childhood. That's the one I was thinking of, but I couldn't think of the name. Early childhood. So students can be certified as a classroom assistant, for example, and these are kids that generally would move on to an education career later. Which one? Accounting. So there's an accounting program as well. So all of these programs, we have agreements with colleges and also with businesses who will support us. It's really, really exciting. And so hopefully next year I can report that we have far more than 3, but that's the goal. Okay. All right. The other thing for me to show you is, in addition to the operating budget, the school budget always includes also bond payments. So any bonds that are in existence for construction projects, improvement projects, right? We are, prior to this year, we had only 1 remaining bond for the entire school district, and the amount of money that we would be paying is $380,438. So that's the existing bond. It actually is paid off in the 2020s. So before the end of this decade, all of the bonds that we've ever had for building the schools and all the improvements on the schools prior to this year, this is it, $380,000. And this one kind of fades out every year. It gets a little bit lower. And by the end of the 2020s, that will be completely paid off. But as you know, there is a new bond that was approved, and the first payment on that bond is due in the 23 school year. So it needs to be included in our planning for next school year. That bond, the new bond payment, is an additional $304,000. Okay, so that bond is a 30-year bond, correct, Bob? 30. And so that will be, for a short period of time, we'll have the new bond plus paying off the end of the last remaining bond that we have. But then once that first bond is paid off, this will be the only payment that we have. And this particular bond, the payments are roughly equivalent over the course of the 30 years. This is not a bond that starts high and then works its way down. Once we build it into the budget for this year, it's pretty static. So we won't see additional increases or annual decreases along the way. So with that being said, let's take a look at the impact. So the first thing that you see, it's kind of highlighted here in orange a little bit. This is nothing for you to worry about. This is the impact as it would have been based on the initial draft So when everybody put in everything that they wanted, this would have been the impact. 9.13% for Exeter, 7.35% increase to West Greenwich. Obviously, that can't happen. And this, by the way, also includes all the bond payments, including the new one, okay? But the superintendent recommended budget, which is now the school committee approved budget, and the one that is going forward to the voters is represented in green. And you can see that even with that additional bond payment, we were able to keep both of the towns below 4%, and the overall increase is 2.86%. And that is because it's the 1.58% on the operating budget. We have the increase in the bond payment, the new bond payment, and then the fluctuations in what the state is giving us in those other categories. We went up a little bit, we lost a little bit. So the end result is overall a 2.86% increase, but it is not equitably dispersed between the two towns. Does anybody remember why? Well, you know, I have the same people that come to my meetings every year. I figured I'd ask, right? So this has to do with, and I'm asking the question because this is connected to one of our charter review amendment questions that is also on the ballot for this year. The reason why we see a difference is because the way that our current charter reads is every year we take a population count on October 1st, and that population count defines the apportionment to the two towns based on where the kids reside. So in the 2021-22 school year, the year that we're in, Exeter owned 48.10% of the student population, and West Greenwich owned 51.90% of the student population. Therefore, they get assigned 48.1% of the total that the two towns have to pay to the schools, right? After we take out all the revenues, whatever's left, the towns are responsible for. And it's not even, it's based on the population count per town. So every year on October 1st, we do that count. And in 21-22, Exeter had 48.10% of the population. For October 1st of this school year, which impacts the 22-23 budget, the one that we're talking about tonight, that number went from 48.10% to 48.63%. So it seems like a really small change. But when you are dealing with 48.63% of $27,812,971, that small change in a percentage has a pretty significant impact on what the town has to pay. So I want to just demonstrate that for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in the exact same percentages as we have this year, right? So that we can see what would the impact have been had we had no population change at all. Everything just stayed the same. So if I plug in 48.10 and 51.9, exactly 2.86 per town. So it went from 3.99% to 2.86%, just based on this very small change in the percentage of students from Exeter and the percentage of students from West Greenwich, right? Because I know 2.86% looks a lot better than 3.99%, but that's the reality. That very small shift in population, which is controlled by the language of the charter, has that kind of an impact on what each of the towns pay. The other thing that I want to show you is we really want to compare apples to apples. The one additional thing that is new this year is the new bond. So if I were to zero out that bond so that everything remains the same as what it was last year, right? We didn't have that bond payment last year and the population stayed the same. That would be the impact to the two towns. So the total operating increase is 1.58%, but because there are some reductions in what the state is giving us in other aid categories, it is a little bit higher than 1.58% as an impact to the taxpayers, but it's below 2. So this is if we're comparing apples to apples. Population stays exactly the same, and we did not add the new bond, which has already been approved by the voters in the past. Once you add the bond in, I'll put that back, 304,738. That brings us up to 2.86. And then once we adjust for the swing in the population, 48.63 and 51.37, it brings us to the numbers that we're sitting at here. So you can see that these small shifts really can account for that difference between the two towns. Okay. All right, questions on this? Okay. What I would like to do is I want to talk a little bit about the charter amendments, because there are 3 additional questions on the ballot this year besides approving the school operating budget. 2 of the questions have really not a significant impact on the way that things currently happen, but they update really the current rules and laws and the way that we're currently doing business, that we wanted to make sure that the charter kind of matched that. So for example, there is one charter question that talks about the building committee and the role and responsibility of the building committee. When the original charter was written, the charge of the building committee was to oversee construction of this building, which, as you can see, has been constructed for now 30 plus years, right? Really what the building committee currently does is not look at building new buildings and overseeing the construction of a brand new school. It's really overseeing improvement projects. So for example, that bond that was approved last year included a brand new heating and ventilation air conditioning system here at the high school. That project is about 99% complete. And it was like $4.8 million to get that done. That's part of the bond that was approved and part of what that building committee oversees. But the language in the charter really spoke to building a school as opposed to overseeing and supervising the improvements that are now happening across the district, right? So we wanted to kind of update that. And additionally, the question also, or the improvements in the language also define the various ways that we can approve school improvement projects. So one of the ways is to have a bond approved by the voters. That's the way that we did it most recently. But in the past several years, we've actually been doing it without going to the taxpayers, because if we have money that is unassigned, we have often taken that unassigned money and assigned it to capital improvements so that we can stay up with the improvements that are necessary across our district without having an impact on the taxpayers. We already got that money. We experience savings throughout the school year, which is a really good thing. And then we take that money and apply it to something so we don't have to go to the taxpayers and say we need money for improvements in our schools. That's how we funded all of our safety projects, a lot of the camera systems, the improved entryways in all of our buildings. So that's a strategy, but that was not outlined in the charter. So basically that charter question just says, here are all the ways that we can get approval for improvement projects. Here is what the building committee's responsibility is. And here's the process for how we move things from a recommendation to a building committee for approval, and then ultimately to the school committee for approval. So it really just kind of reflects current practice. That's one of the questions. The second question has to do with making changes to the charter. So as we were going through this process of reviewing the charter to make changes, we realized that the section of the charter that described the process that we had to go through to get approval for charter changes was a little bit vague in certain areas. So now it defines the way that townspeople can try to get a change to the charter. Like if there's something that you're really interested in, there's a way that townspeople can initiate through petition, get enough signatures, bring it to the town council, bring it to the school committee, so that it defines that strategy. And then it also defines how the school committee can initiate a review committee, a charter review committee with equal representation from both of our towns, West Greenwich and Exeter. And then those changes are reviewed by a committee, just like they were in this case. They then get approved at the town council level and also at the school committee level before they go to the voters, which is exactly what happened in this case as well. So that change really is just to correct some of the language that was vague in the existing charter. Okay, so no financial impact. The third question, which I believe is the second one on the ballot, and I put them in the order that they appear in the actual charter, so I think it's the second question. That one has to do with the way that the apportionment is calculated. And by apportionment, I mean what I just demonstrated to you. When there is a population change, so if Exeter has an increase in the percentage of kids that are enrolled in the schools, or if West Greenwich has an increase. As you can see, a very small change, right? I just demonstrated that, has a pretty significant impact on the total percentage, the impact of the percentage to the towns for tax purposes. And what has happened over the past 10 years that I've been here is that on certain years, you have a class that graduates that might not mirror the population of the whole district. So in other words, you may have the senior class where 64% of the kids are from West Greenwich and only 36% are from Exeter. And then when those kids graduate and we bring a new population of kids in to kindergarten, for example, that doesn't have a 64-36 split, you end up with a massive change in the population just because there was a disproportionate grade level that graduated, right? So we've experienced times when the percent change was as much as 1 or 1.2% of the population. So just to demonstrate, if we went from 48.1 to say 49.2, look what happens. And that has happened multiple times over the past several years, where an increase of more than 1% has this massive impact on one town or the other. We've experienced it both ways. There was a year where Exeter had a massive increase. There was a year where West Greenwich had like an 8% increase. None of those are feasible under normal circumstances, but because the charter is written so that it's taken on an annual basis based on the October 1st enrollment, there's nothing we can do about it. A massive population shift means that one town is going to get hit with an increase in their responsibility. But at the same time, if one town gets hit with a massive increase, what happens to the other town? They go down. So we've had times where Exeter has had like an 8% increase or a 7% increase, and West Greenwich has had nothing. Or in the case of, I want to say it was a couple of years back, where one town had an increase and the other town actually had a decrease. And then the following year, the reverse happened. So you, as a resident, as a taxpayer, you're trying to kind of figure out like how am I going to budget when we have no idea what the population swing is going to be? And it could be this massive movement of kids from one town or the other. And so we saw what we called the shark teeth, right? So you had this amount of payment, and then the following year it spiked up, and then the next year it went back down again, and then it went up a little bit. So you're kind of all over the place. What we've decided to do, we had the whole purpose of bringing the Charter Review Committee back together was to look at alternative ways that we could fairly determine the way that the payment would go to the two towns, so we could kind of smooth out those annual massive levels of change, right? So I'm going to show you what that looks like. bring that other sheet up. Hold on one second. Okay, so I know this is there's a lot of numbers here, but I'm going to try to stay inside this box right here that I've put in bold. I have the bold highlights around it. This represents the last 4 years, including the year that we're looking at right now, the 2022-23 school year. The basic premise is that instead of doing the calculation based on October 1st of the prior year, we're working our way into a 5-year rolling average, so that every year we look back 5 years and take an average of the enrollment, which then kind of smooths out those annual increases and decreases. And the change to the town, the premise is that the changes to the town will kind of level off over time, so that we're not experiencing those massive changes on an annual basis, which have impacted both of our towns. So just to kind of show you, this is actual, right? So we studied this. This was part of the work that we did on the committee, but we went back 20 plus years to kind of play this out. How would this have rolled out over the last 20 years if we were using a 5-year rolling average? And just to demonstrate, in the last 5 years, these are the actual numbers. So in 2019-20, there was a 1.77% increase to Exeter and a 1.12% increase to West Greenwich. In 2021, a 0.13% increase to one town and a 0.28% increase to the other town. And then last year, 1.25%. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. It's the yellow and green. So there was a 1.12% increase to Exeter and a 2.34% increase to West Greenwich. Then the following year, there was a 0.28% increase to Exeter. West Greenwich had 0. Then last year, Exeter had a 5.44% increase because we lost a ton of kids because of the pandemic, and a large number of those children were in the earliest grades, preschool and kindergarten, which are not mandated by law. And our preschool and kindergarten programs are heavily populated by West Greenwich children. So we lost a ton of West Greenwich kids, which then made the percentage of kids in our district from Exeter go up, and there was a 5.44% increase. And we are only allowed to increase by 4% on an annual basis. There's a law that protects that. Whenever we go over that 4%, there's a lot of steps that we have to go through to get that approved. But part of the reason why it was approved is because the charter is written the way that it is. Okay, so that's what happened last year. But look at this. West Greenwich had a negative 2.34%. So they got a reduction in their taxes, and then Exeter got a massive increase. For next year, it's 3.99%, but that's with the bond payment, and West Greenwich has a 1.81%. So imagine that we built this system where we were looking at a 5-year rolling average. This is what it would have been. And you can see that the numbers begin to get closer together, certainly than what they were under the current rules, right? Almost the same, a small increase for Exeter, where West Greenwich had an increase, and it was the reverse, but it has to do with the fact that over the 5 years, the average just kind of levels it out a little bit. Last year, instead of Exeter having a 5.44% and West Greenwich having a negative 2.34%, they would have had roughly the same, about a 1.25% increase. And then this year, 3.99% and 1.81 becomes 3.28 and 2.49. So we believe me, we mapped out a 5-year rolling average, a 3-year rolling average, a 7-year rolling average. We talked about tons of different possibilities, and we modeled all of them. And the committee, which consisted of town council members, school committee members, residents, and school department officials, this is what we decided was fair. But we also, showed that it will change those huge increases. I mean, they still could occur, but instead of them being this big, they might be this big, which was the whole goal. And then we wanted to make sure that over the course of an extended period of time, that one town would not be paying tons more money than the other town because of this new formula. And so we kind of, we did that calculation as well. And over time, the difference between what you would have paid under the current rules and what you would pay under the new rules gets closer and closer and closer to being exactly even. I think once I built in the new numbers. So this is what Exeter would have paid under the 5-year rolling average from 2009 to 2023. I should change that because I just put that new number in today. And this is what West Greenwich would have paid over that same amount of time. And then this is what they would have paid under the old rule. So if we just did it on an annual basis, just took the October 1st enrollment from the previous year, we would have all these spikes. But the total payment from Exeter over the course of all of those years would have been $160,275,733 compared to now $160,509,339. Yes, it's different, but every year, as we calculate this, every year the difference between what would have been paid and what actually gets paid with the 5-year rolling average gets closer and closer to being exactly equitable. So that's kind of the premise here. But the bottom line, and I wanted to show you this, is that the impact is that it decreases those big spikes and then the opposite of the big spike, right? So you may not have as much of a savings, but in return, you're also not getting that big spike in one of the connected years. So that was the goal. The goal of the committee was to try to equal that out so that our towns would not be experiencing these tax increases that are beyond what is reasonable based on the way that the population is calculated. So I know that was a lot, but I wanted to at least attempt to explain it and show you the impact. Because that's the most complex of the 3 charter questions that are on the ballot. So I will stop. I can always put the charts back up and I can answer any questions that you might have. Yes, question. Oh, yeah. You know what? That's a great one. So on the paper that I gave you, there's a couple of things. I don't really need to put the chart back up, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. So I wrote my own notes on here, but you can see them. I wanted to demonstrate what would happen if we did not have a new bond payment. This is like the bottom right-hand corner of the front page. These are my notes, my presentation notes. And then I wanted to demonstrate what would happen if we didn't have the population shift. So I did that. But I highlighted the career and technical education. I did that. But I want to talk about the pandemic relief because that has been a question that has come up a few times, right? How are you spending this money that the school department has received from the federal government because of the pandemic? Because every school district in the state of Rhode Island has received multiple payments so that we could continue to keep our schools open. The first round of payments for us was relatively small. I think the first payment that we got was only like $140,000. We used that to pay for the increase in busing. Maybe you know, but that first year that we reopened after the 3 months of closing in March of 2020 till the end of the school year, when we reopened the following year, we actually had to add an entire new tier of busing because we had to limit the number of kids on a bus at any given time. So we had to stagger the start times of our elementary school. So the younger kids went in first, I think. No, the younger kids went in later so that the older kids would be home first in case they needed to help take care of them. That's how we did it. But in order for us to do that, the elementary had to add a whole other run, which of course had a pretty significant increase in what we had to pay. We used the bulk of that first stimulus money to pay for the increase in the buses. So we were committed to never coming back to the towns to say we need more money so that we can make all of these rules, these new guidelines work for us. We used money that we had left over in fund balance, and then we used the stimulus money that we were getting from the state. We also used it for things like the masks and the air filtration devices that we needed in all of our classrooms. So all of those additional things, the extra cleaning, the extra staff that we needed for cleaning in that first year because there were very strict requirements, every bit of that was paid out of stimulus money. So we never had to go back to the town to say we need more in order to keep us open. The last round of money is the largest amount. And for us, it's about 1.4 million, I think. 1.4 million is that's the last amount, right? That's a pretty substantial amount of money. But that can be spent over the course of from now until the end of the current school year, and then into the next 2 school years after. So it can be spread out over multiple years. And there are very specific rules about how it can be spent. We needed to focus on addressing the social emotional needs of children because there are a lot of kids and families that have been impacted by the pandemic. A lot of anxiety, a lot of just an increase in those needs. So we have increased our staff that we have available to work with our kids and our families, and we continue to pay for that through the stimulus money, including the money that 1.4 million, the application was just approved last week. So we haven't been able to spend any of it yet. We just got the application approved last week. And so it will kind of kick in for next school year. And we are paying for an additional psychologist to have available because we have just a tremendous increase in need in that area. And then we have to address learning loss. So kids were not in school for in-person learning every day over the past 2 years. They were quarantined. Even if they had the opportunity to show up, they were quarantined for 14 to 20 days at a time in some cases. When the kids are not in person for learning, it absolutely impacted them. So there are gaps in their learning. So we have really targeted additional supports for our children, including summer enrichment and ramp-up opportunities. That was free to every parent in the district last year. We offered something for all kids in the summer. That was free. We used one of the older stimulus funds, and we'll continue to use some of the money in the new the 1.4 to pay for some of those things in the future. We have math and reading supports available. We've ramped those up, particularly at the junior high school and at the elementary schools. And here's how we were also able to use the money through an allowable expense that helped us with the local operating budget as well. Prior to the pandemic, there were 2 laws that were passed requiring the school districts, all school districts in Rhode Island, to make sure that every elementary classroom teacher, every special educator in the district, and every reading teacher in the district, or everybody with those certifications, which then includes me, needed to be trained in the science of reading, which sounds reasonable. But the science of reading course that we're required to do is about 125 hours. And that means that we need a trainer, we need materials, we need to pay for the additional time that we have to assign teachers to do this work, and it's required through legislation. That would have been something that we would have to budget for in the operating budget, which would have bumped what we were requesting. But we wrote our own grant, which we received, that offset a lot of those expenses. And then we included all the rest of the expenses related to that science of reading, which is a legislative requirement. We put all of those expenses in the $1.4 million application that we just got approved last week. So that will be taken care of. We're going to meet that requirement, but at no cost to the taxpayers, because we've taken advantage of that stimulus money as an allowable expense. And in addition to that, there was a law that was passed that required every school district to adopt math, science, reading, and ELA curriculum materials off of a specific list vetted by the Department of Education. And they call it high quality curriculum materials, to the tune of about $900,000 it will cost us to get the materials for all of the requirements that we are required to do legislatively. Originally, we posted for the expenses that hit for this year, we put them in last year's budget. But then when we got the rules for how the stimulus could be utilized, we realized that they allowed us to assign funds from the stimulus to adopt the high quality curriculum materials, which we know legislatively in Rhode Island we're required to do. So we pulled all of those expenses out of the budget last year. And then in the current application that just got approved last week, all the rest of the expenses over the next 3 years related to math and science and the last part of the reading transition, all of those expenses are in the grant. So we've pulled all of those current and future required expenses for the adoption of new curriculum. We've pulled them out of the local budget and assigned them to that stimulus. So in essence, the stimulus money has helped us offset the operating budget, but we could only do so based on the rules that were given to us, and we took full advantage of it. So I wanted to highlight those things. I know I wrote them down, and thank you for reminding me of that, because I totally slipped my mind. Yes. Our reading instruction does include compliance and yes. Yeah, I think, initially when that law was passed, where every single elementary classroom teacher and special educator had to receive this training and certification in the science of reading. Initially, I thought to myself, this is really a good thing, right? Because it is going to ramp up the skill set of all of the teachers that will then be able to help every kid read at optimal levels. So I agree with it, but trying to figure out how we were going to fund it was the struggle. And we were able to do so. We're halfway through the training at this point. I'm taking the training as well because I have a special education teaching certificate. So in order for me to maintain my certificate, I have to be trained. It's really valuable. And I think it's making a big difference, not just with the reading teachers and the special educators, but with the regular ed teachers that are with the kids for the bulk of the day as well. So we're on track for all of that. I couldn't agree with you more. So we have our schedule is really different. We we offer our course. So they take 4 classes per semester. Most semesters, they take a class every other day of the year. We take them every day of the course. Our kids have got 8 credits per year compared to most high schools. And we've also done a lot of work to build in flexibilities in the way that we courses are scheduled. Big deal at the time. We actually shifted one of our 8 courses to 10th grade. So here we're looking at 100%. We changed it from 12 to now 10. And we also, those classes run for every day for the first semester, and then they run for the second semester, more time, so that they can make that so really creative, flexible thinking. Yeah, we don't really have to go here. We want them to take them, but instead of making them take that many, we have to so for the last 3 years, we've been on the power. We are at 75 to 85%. Much higher than the state national average. But you can, no problem. Anything else? Andrea.
I know a question that's about this from the parents of summer and specifically the
Mhm.
do you have an idea of what will be offered?
So we know that that they're being offered. We are focusing first on making sure that we offer some tutoring for most needy children, and that will be free of charge. That's coming through the grant. And then we know that some families, I was just talking to the principal at Metcalf today, some families are signing up now because they want their child to participate in Camp Invention, which would be a 1-week. I think last year we did 2 2-week sessions. So there'll be 1 session that's offered. And we're not sure yet on how much we can offset that, but it is something that we're looking at. Like, we know that there are some grant funds that we wrote for where the expenses came in a little bit less than what we anticipated. And so we're kind of trying to determine what we have for flexibility to write that in so we can offset that cost for any family that wants to do it. But our first focus this year for this summer is the kids that are still demonstrating gaps, the kids that are most at need, that we're offering free individual small group tutoring throughout the summer so that we can continue to close that gap. So more to come. I don't have a specific answer on that, but it's on our radar. Questions online, Jeremy? No, I don't see any. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, that's my whole presentation, but I'll stick around if you have any additional questions. And thank you for joining me tonight. Reach out if anything comes to your head after this meeting. I'm happy to answer. Okay, thank you so much.